The commodification of sovereignty is one of the most revealing aspects of this entire episode because it exposes how modern power increasingly operates through the language of markets rather than the principles of democracy and self determination. When political leaders speak about purchasing a territory, they are not just making a provocative statement, they are signaling a worldview where land is treated like real estate, where borders become negotiable assets, and where people are reduced to footnotes in a financial calculation. This way of thinking does not emerge by accident. It grows out of an economic system that prioritizes profit, expansion, and accumulation over social responsibility and human rights. Sovereignty, in its original meaning, is supposed to represent the collective will of a people to govern themselves. It is rooted in identity, culture, history, and shared political struggle. But when it is reframed as something that can be bought, that deeper meaning is stripped away. The focus shifts from democratic consent to economic leverage. Wealthy nations begin to assume that financial power can substitute for legitimacy, that writing a large check can replace negotiations based on equality and mutual respect. This creates a dangerous precedent because it normalizes the idea that those with more money deserve more control, more influence, and more territory. This mindset also reflects a corporate model of leadership that has increasingly entered politics. In the corporate world, acquisitions are celebrated as strategic victories. Companies buy competitors, absorb resources, and expand market share. When this logic is transferred to international relations, countries are treated like corporations, and territories are treated like assets to be acquired. The problem is that nations are not companies, and people are not shareholders. They cannot be relocated, rebranded, or reorganized without real human consequences. Communities lose control over their future, cultural identities are marginalized, and political decisions become centralized in distant power centers. There is also a historical dimension that cannot be ignored. The idea of buying land from or over the heads of local populations echoes colonial practices of the past, when powerful empires carved up the world using treaties and transactions that excluded the voices of indigenous peoples. Even when such deals were labeled as legal, they often rested on unequal power relations and economic coercion. To repeat this logic in the modern era, under the banner of strategic investment or national interest, is to revive a form of economic colonialism that many societies are still struggling to overcome. At its core, the commodification of sovereignty reflects a deeper crisis in how we define value. Instead of measuring value in terms of social well being, environmental sustainability, or democratic participation, it is measured in dollars, resources, and strategic advantage. This reduces complex human realities into simplified financial metrics and encourages policymakers to think in terms of transactions rather than responsibilities. When sovereignty becomes a commodity, politics becomes a marketplace, and the future of entire populations is negotiated as if it were part of a business deal rather than a matter of collective human destiny. The climate crisis is increasingly being reframed not as a shared global emergency, but as an economic opportunity for powerful nations and corporations. And this shift in perspective is both alarming and revealing. As Arctic ice melts and previously inaccessible regions become open to navigation and extraction, the conversation quickly moves away from environmental protection and toward profit potential. New shipping routes promise faster trade between continents, untapped reserves of oil, gas, and rare minerals attract corporate interest, and strategic locations suddenly gain immense geopolitical value. What should be a moment for global cooperation and urgent climate action is instead becoming a race for advantage. This transformation exposes a fundamental contradiction in modern economic priorities. On one hand, governments publicly acknowledge the dangers of climate change, the rising sea levels, extreme weather, and threats to food security. On the other hand, the same governments and industries position themselves to benefit from the very destruction they claim to oppose. Melting ice becomes a gateway to wealth rather than a warning sign of planetary collapse. This creates a perverse incentive structure where environmental damage is not just tolerated but indirectly rewarded through access to new markets and resources. In the case of Greenland and the broader Arctic region, the stakes are particularly high. The region holds vast reserves of rare earth elements essential for modern technologies, from smartphones to renewable energy infrastructure. It also sits at the crossroads of emerging trade routes that could reshape global commerce. As a result, climate change is turning the Arctic into a new frontier of competition, where powerful states seek to secure influence before their rivals do. This competition is not driven by the needs of local communities or environmental preservation, but by strategic calculations tied to military positioning, corporate profits, and long-term dominance. What often gets lost in this narrative are the voices of indigenous populations and local residents who are directly affected by these changes. For them, melting ice is not an opportunity. It is a threat to traditional livelihoods, housing stability, and cultural survival. When policymakers discuss Arctic development in terms of investment and expansion, they frequently ignore the social and human costs imposed on these communities. This reinforces a pattern where marginalized groups bear the consequences of environmental damage while powerful actors reap the financial rewards. There is also a moral dimension to this issue that deserves serious attention. Treating climate change as a business opportunity sends a message that the global system is more interested in adapting to disaster for profit than in preventing it for the sake of humanity. It suggests a future where resilience is measured not by how well we protect vulnerable populations, but by how effectively we monetize crisis. This approach undermines collective responsibility and weakens international cooperation because it encourages competition instead of solidarity. Ultimately, the reframing of climate crisis as economic opportunity reflects a deeper failure of political imagination. Instead of using this moment to radically transform energy systems, reduce inequality, and prioritize sustainability, global powers are doubling down on extractive models that created the crisis in the first place. The Arctic becomes a symbol not of environmental awakening, but of how capitalism adapts to catastrophe by turning even planetary destruction into a new market frontier. Resource competition and military strategy form the hidden backbone of the growing interest in Greenland and the Arctic, and understanding this dimension is essential to grasp the real motivations behind high-profile political statements. Beneath the public talk of economic deals and strategic partnerships lies a deeper struggle over control, influence, and long-term power projection. The Arctic is no longer viewed as a remote and frozen frontier. It is now being reimagined as a central theater in global competition, where access to resources and military positioning can reshape the balance of power. At the center of this competition are rare earth minerals and critical raw materials that are essential for modern economies. These resources are vital for producing advanced technologies such as electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, communication devices, and defense equipment. As global demand for these materials continues to rise, countries are increasingly concerned about supply chain security. Dependence on foreign suppliers is seen as a strategic vulnerability, and securing domestic or allied sources becomes a national priority. Greenland's mineral potential, therefore, is not just an economic opportunity. It is a strategic asset that fits directly into broader efforts to reduce reliance on rival powers. Alongside resource access, military strategy plays a crucial role in shaping interest in the region. The Arctic offers unique geographic advantages, including shorter missile flight paths, expanded surveillance capabilities, and access to key maritime routes. As polar ice recedes, naval mobility increases, making the region more accessible for military operations. This has prompted major powers to expand their Arctic presence, invest in ice capable fleets, and strengthen alliances in the region. What was once considered a low tension zone is gradually becoming a space of heightened strategic competition. This militarization of the Arctic reflects a broader pattern in global politics where security concerns are increasingly tied to economic interests. Protecting resource access, controlling shipping lanes, and maintaining regional dominance become intertwined objectives. As a result, economic investments are often accompanied by military infrastructure, surveillance systems, and strategic agreements. This combination of economic and military expansion creates a feedback loop where each justifies the other, reinforcing a cycle of competition and escalation. The danger of this approach lies in its long term consequences. When regions become arenas of strategic rivalry, cooperation becomes more difficult and trust erodes. Instead of building shared frameworks for environmental protection and peaceful development, states prioritize unilateral advantage. This raises the risk of miscalculation, diplomatic conflict, and even military confrontation. The Arctic, with its fragile ecosystem and vulnerable communities, is particularly ill suited for such power struggles, yet it is being pulled directly into them. At the same time, the public narrative often downplays these strategic realities. Political leaders tend to frame their actions in terms of economic growth, national interest, or technological leadership, while avoiding direct discussion of military competition and geopolitical rivalry. This creates a gap between what is presented to the public and what actually drives policy decisions. Citizens are told about investment and opportunity, but the underlying logic is about positioning, deterrence, and long term dominance. Ultimately, the convergence of resource competition and military strategy in the Arctic highlights how modern geopolitics operates through layered motivations. Economic interests, security concerns, and political ambitions merge into a single strategic agenda. Greenland and the Arctic region become symbols of this transformation, where territory is valued not for its people or environment, but for its potential to enhance power, secure advantage, and shape the future balance of global influence. Political spectacle and domestic messaging play a central role in shaping how bold territorial claims are presented to the public, and this dynamic reveals much about the modern media driven political environment. When leaders make dramatic announcements about acquiring land or expanding national influence, They are not only speaking to foreign governments, they are performing for domestic audiences. These statements are designed to dominate headlines, generate viral debates, and project an image of strength, decisiveness, and authority. In an age where attention is currency, spectacle becomes a powerful political tool. Such claims often function as strategic distractions. At moments when governments face criticism over economic inequality, rising living costs, healthcare struggles, or political scandals, dramatic foreign policy statements can shift public focus. Instead of discussing wage stagnation or social safety nets, the conversation moves toward national pride, global dominance, and geopolitical ambition. This redirection of attention allows leaders to reframe public debate on their own terms, emphasizing external challenges rather than internal responsibilities. Domestic messaging also relies heavily on the language of deal making and economic success, presenting foreign policy decisions as business transactions appeals to audiences that value efficiency, profit, and competitive advantage. The idea of getting a good deal on a massive territorial acquisition feeds into narratives of economic strength and smart leadership. It suggests that the nation is winning in the global marketplace, even when the practical benefits to ordinary citizens remain unclear or minimal. This framing turns complex geopolitical issues into simplified stories of success and failure, winners and losers. Media dynamics further amplify this process. Sensational headlines and provocative statements are more likely to attract clicks, views, and engagement. As a result, nuanced discussions about international law, indigenous rights, and environmental consequences often receive less attention than bold, controversial sound bites. The political spectacle thrives in this environment, where shock value and emotional reactions outperform detailed policy analysis. This creates a feedback loop in which leaders are rewarded for dramatic rhetoric rather than responsible governance. Another important aspect of this spectacle is how it reinforces nationalist sentiment. Claims about expanding territory or increasing global influence appeal to ideas of national greatness and historical destiny. They create a narrative in which the nation is portrayed as strong, assertive, and capable of shaping the world according to its interests. While this can temporarily boost public support, it also risks deepening divisions, both domestically and internationally. National pride becomes intertwined with territorial ambition, making compromise and cooperation appear weak or unpatriotic. Behind this theatrical display lies a deeper issue of accountability. When political communication is dominated by spectacle, it becomes harder for citizens to evaluate real policy outcomes. The focus shifts from measurable improvements in quality of life to symbolic gestures and rhetorical victories. Leaders are judged by how effectively they command attention rather than by how well they address structural problems. This undermines democratic engagement by turning politics into entertainment rather than a serious process of collective decision making. In this environment, foreign policy announcements are no longer just diplomatic statements. They are carefully crafted performances aimed at shaping public perception, controlling narratives, and reinforcing political identities. The spectacle becomes part of the strategy itself, blurring the line between governance and showmanship and transforming global politics into a stage where image often matters more than substance. Economic imperialism and global power imbalance represent the long term consequences of treating financial strength as a substitute for political legitimacy, and this pattern has deep roots in the history of international relations. When powerful nations use money, investment, and economic pressure to influence the sovereignty of smaller regions, they create a system where control is exercised not only through military force, but through financial dominance. This form of power is often presented as cooperation or partnership, yet it frequently reproduces the same unequal relationships that characterized earlier eras of colonial expansion.